כאשר אתה מסתכל בראי, כן?
כן.
אתה לא סתם רואה את עצמך, אתה רואה את עצמך מסתכל בראי.
כן, אני
נכון?
הבנתי, כן.
כשישראלי חושב על עצמו,
כן.
הוא לא סתם חושב על עצמו, הוא תמיד חושב את עצמו בלי האחר.
בלי האחר. על השניים, כן.
לא רגע, בלי האחר.
כן.
Okay. Then, as I say, half a year ago, in the most famous journal in Israel, was published an article of a professor from Tel Aviv University that has the name Zeev Herzog. In this article, long article, he put forward a thesis that become more or less a consensus between Israeli archaeologists. I say more or less because there are a few others that don't agree, but most of them agree with this thesis. By the way, it is the consensus between archaeologists, specialists of digging in Palestine. This thesis became a consensus long time ago. Now, what is this thesis about the past of this land of Palestine? Till I think the 20s of our century, maybe a bit later, a lot of archaeologists took for granted the stories of the Bible and followed them in searching evidence for the stories. During the last 50 years, more or less, more and more archaeologists joined the idea that most of the stories of the first part of the Bible has not any evidence in the territory. Now, we know that the archaeologic developed a lot of new things, much more easier to identify, to fix a date. Now, the thesis that Zeev Herzog, Professor Herzog, developed in this article is that probably the conquest of Canaan, old Palestine, Canaan, that was described in the Bible, has not any proof that it happened. Not only of this, there is a lot of proof. This is important today. There is a lot of proof that in the date, more or less, that the Bible is telling the story, there was not a conquest of this territory by people that came from abroad. This is one of the theses. There is not any proof that Yeshua ben Nun exists, that Moses exists, and all the going out from Egypt was a legend without any basic. In this legend, this theory of sources of the Jewish people, from Abraham through Moses till coming to Canaan, was a legend that was invented much more later in the late of the Judah kingdom in the area. This is one of the things. There is a consensus that it wasn't a conquest of this. Now, the hypothesis, their hypothesis of Herzog and others is that the Canaanian, the people from Canaan, slowly started to accept the Yehovah God as their God. And the proof that they find in a lot of places is that people from the coast of Canaan started to move to the mountain. In this process, they don't know exactly the reason. People from the coast moved little by little and built villages on the mountain, and they started, besides to work for the god Yehovah, the god of the Jew. But amazing is that till very, very late, they discovered every place of cult of gods, they found two gods, not only one. Yehovah from one side, in a god, feminine god, Ashtaroth. More or less, it's proved that the people that were lived here, the Canaanians that become, if I can say Hebraic, if you want, or sons of Israel, wasn't exactly monotheist. Monotheism developed much later. Now, it shocked the Israeli public because, you know, the Passover every year, Jewish in the world, Jewish in Israel, have the Passover and telling the going out from Egypt as slaves. And suddenly, specialist, scientific from archaeology says that all the things doesn't happen. It was shocked. Now I have here the reaction, if you want. I didn't finish. I mean, there is other theses about the Bible. For example, as I say, it's quite a consensus that the first part of the Bible was a pure invention that was created for ideological necessity of the late kingdom. They wanted to build back, genealogically of a Jewish people, to reinforce their domination of this population that was living here.
Yeah, we have also some examples here, but this is our study collection.
I see.
And we conduct the pottery.
Better here.
Yeah. The pottery classes, and we teach our students all the shapes of pottery, from the early bronze, middle bronze, late bronze, Iron Age, each period. And if you see, well, these are the bigger the storage vessels, which we. I am also giving the classes of, and inside here we have the smaller hundreds of vessels, which their shape changes from one period to another. So when we excavate and we find a vessel, we can identify the period from the pottery because of the change of the types and of the shape of the pottery vessel.
Can you show me the time of David?
Yes, what we call the United Monarchy. We have these red painted vessels. This is very typical to the 10th century. The red paint and burnish. So this would be the 10th century, later the 8th century, and 7th century, and so on. So this will be the 8th century.
And the time of Joshua?
Well,
Excuse me.
yeah, we don't know where Joshua lived, but anyhow, the late Bronze Age. This is the Canaanite, the late Canaanite material, the late Bronze Age. Yeah. Yes. There is some Philistine pottery here, the painted one. Well, I wanted to present to the general public of Israelis and other the results of archaeological research which in the last 20 years develop concepts that the historical events as exposed by the archaeological expeditions and research present a different sequence of history than the one described in the Bible. And the accumulation of data caused the conclusions that we are now facing an entire revolution in our attitude to the biblical records. Archaeologists agree on these conclusions in the basically for many years. Archaeologists, historians, Bible scholars, but the general public was not aware of these results, and I decided that it's time to present to them this revolution. And what is a revolution? Actually, it relates to the earlier phases of the history of the Israelites, the phases, the pre-monarchical, the phases before the erection of the states of Judah and Israel, the period of proto-history of Israel, which is very described in many details in the Old Testament, the periods of the patriarchs, the period of the sojourn in Egypt, the slavery in Egypt, the Exodus, the military conquest of Palestine by the invaders, newcomers. All these are very basic and important chapters in history of early Israel. And as I said, archaeology presents an entirely different picture. Archaeology, as we know it now, indicates that there were no fortified cities in Canaan at that time, that the occupants of this of the new occupants of the early Iron Age, of the so-called settlement period, have nothing in their culture originating from Egypt, that they are entirely local cultural tradition developed from the local population. And the combination of all these observations means that the Israelites, the ancient Israelites, actually developed within the country, did not come from outside. And they are the descendants of the local Canaanites, which for several political and probably also climatical reasons changed their way of life and moved from the cities in the lowland or from their nomadic, pastoral nomadic background and settled in the hill country. And these new settlements are this is the population from which later the states of Judah and Israel developed. So it's entirely new and different sequence of events from the one which is described in the Old Testament. Now we know that the Old Testament is a literature. It is a piece of literature which was composed relatively late from ideological, religious purposes. So obviously it had some motives and interest in presenting the history in some way, which not necessarily was the historical one. At the beginning, it was hoped that archaeological excavations would expose the data and would support the biblical tradition. Now we see that the process was different, that the more we excavate, the more we interpret the finds, the more we are aware that the historical process was different than the biblical one. Well, yeah, Jericho and some other cities which are described in large details in the biblical descriptions were excavated. They were excavated by several expeditions, and obviously each expedition intended to find the walls of that Joshua destroyed. And surprisingly, expedition after the expedition came to the conclusion that there were no city walls in the period which we assume that this conquest had to happen. Now, Jericho is not an exception. There were other sites like Hai, which is also described in the book of Joshua as a city fortified, and the whole conquest is described in details. And Hai was also identified, excavated by two expeditions, no fortifications, no city at all. Moreover, we know now that not only Jericho and Hai, but I studied the archaeology of the city, the concept of city planning in different periods. And when you look at the late Bronze Age, you realize that there were no fortifications in any of the cities in Canaan at that time. The whole country was very populated very poorly, and there were no fortified cities. So the whole concept of conquering a land which has many cities, fortified cities, as it is described in the Bible. The Bible speaks about city walls rising high to the sky. There were no city walls at all. It's a later reconstruction of a past which is not supported. So it's not a question that we did not find the evidence. We did find the evidence, but the evidence we found is entirely different. And this is why we are so, it is clear, and all archaeologists agree, that these stories are legends, are etiological stories, are later reconstructions, but they are not historical.
Can you speak more about Jerusalem?
Well, Jerusalem, in my article, I mentioned the problem of even later period, the United Monarchy, the period of David and Solomon. Again, the archaeological evidence presents us entirely different picture. In the Bible, the monarchy of David and Solomon is a very strong and prestigious and empire, ruling from the Euphrates down to the border of Egypt, with international relations and connections. When we excavate the sites everywhere, and especially in Jerusalem, we find out that this period is very poor one, not with very few buildings. Again, with no fortifications, no palaces, no monumental structures. We do find in Jerusalem very interesting and rich evidence from later period, from the 8th century, from the times of Hezekiah and others. We do find very interesting and information about earlier periods, like the Middle Bronze Age. So there is evidence in Jerusalem, but there is very limited evidence on the period of this United Monarchy. And therefore, not only, as I said, it's not only in Jerusalem the case. It's also in the Hebron, for example, which was excavated, and many other sites, Lachish, and in most of the cities, this was a relatively very limited and quite poor period, and therefore you cannot accept this description, this glorified biblical description of this period. It had to be very limited kingdom, and not the large united kingdom as it is described in the Bible. You have to remember that we do not even have even the Bible does not give us the name of this United Kingdom. We call it United Kingdom, but this was not the ancient name. It didn't have even the name. We don't have the name of it. Pharaoh Shishak, who invaded Palestine in the short after the death of Solomon, according to the biblical description, and we have also Egyptian records for this, does not mention the kingdoms of Judah and Israel. He conquers cities around the country as but not states. He doesn't mention the states, and it is, in my opinion, another indication that the states of Israel and Judah were not yet consolidated, were not even at that time, that they did emerge relatively late, as Professor Finkelstein argues, and I guess I understand that you will be talking to him also. Now, all this is still my description relies on the older chronology, on the traditional chronology. Professor Finkelstein suggested to lower the dates of the United Monarchy by of the objects and pottery mainly found by 100 years, and this will make the period of the United Monarchy even poorer and even with less structures than we assumed before. And if this lowering of date is accepted, and it is now discussed by many archaeologists. But even in the traditional view, this period was not as glorified as the Bible tells us.
When I visited Jerusalem, I went to so-called City of David.
Yes.
What is?
City of David is the old part of Jerusalem which developed next to the spring of Gihon. This is the only water source of the city, and this is why the first occupations were constructed next to this spring. And we have there, again, the name City of David is a modern name, of course. The Arabic name of this site was Silwan, and but this is the old occupation of Jerusalem. As I mentioned before, it was fortified in the Middle Bronze Age. Later, it was probably diminished in power, because in the Late Bronze Age, again the Canaanite occupation, there are very limited and poor remains of this site. So there are some, if you have been to the city, you may see there are some houses on the slope which date to the later periods of the monarchy of Judah, in the 8th century, in the 7th century, in the early 6th century. Then we have interesting and important documentation. But again, not on the earlier. The United Monarchy is practically missing there. It was not represented in the archaeological finds.
So, how does from which age exactly archaeology and the Bible go together?
Well, we believe that at least from the 9th century, in the kingdom of Israel, in the northern kingdom, the period of Ahab, in Samaria, in Jezreel, in Hatzor, we do have interesting finds which represent the strength and the flourishing of this northern kingdom. In Judah, the process was probably even slightly slower, still late 9th century or 8th century. Then we have interesting and evidence. We have inscriptions, Hebrew inscriptions, which resemble the biblical Hebrew, and we have correlations between the Bible, the Assyrian documentation, and archaeology from the 9th and 8th centuries, I would say. This is the more historical period. This is also the period which is closer to the time when the Old Testament, or the earliest parts of the Old Testament, were written down. They were transferred from oral tradition to written tradition, written documentation, and therefore naturally this period is better documented in the Old Testament.
I visited many places, yes, not so many, but I asked, okay, from here, did you find some Jewish inscription or Hebrew inscription?
Yes.
Well, what is the ancient one until now you found?
It is interesting question because, you know, Hebrew is a language which is a part of a group of languages. We call it Phoenician. And this is the same script. So if you find Phoenician inscription, you don't know if it's Hebrew or local. Phoenicians are Canaanites in their tradition. It is very hard to distinguish between them. Even the neighboring countries had similar scripts, like the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Arameans, all wrote in the same. The Aramean inscription from Tel Dan is written exactly in the same characters as the Hebrew, but it's Aramean. So it is hard to identify the nationality, the ethnicity from the inscriptions. Still, when we have inscriptions like from Tel Arad, the clearest and safe date is the 8th century. From the 8th century, we have many inscriptions, which mean that this was the period from the people were literary, that they could read, that they could write, and this is the period again which Professor Nadav Ne'eman is suggesting that this is the period when the historicity of the Bible is more assured. So archaeology and the inscription in this respect cooperate and collaborate.
I heard that in the school here in Israel, still children are studying the Bible as a history, yes? Or not exactly like this?
Yes, in here and in many places in the world, the Old Testament, the Bible, is considered as historical. In Israel, it has also cultural importance because our holidays are the biblical holidays. You know, the main festivals like Pesach and Shavuot and Sukkot are festivals which are connected with the Exodus, with the wandering in the desert, with the acceptance of the Torah in Mount Sinai. So naturally, so when our holidays and festivals are connected with these stories, people, the general people, accept these as historical events. And what I tried in my paper was to explain the difference and the separation between history and mythology. That mythology is very important, and every nation has mythological past, but people has to understand the difference between mythology and history.
You said that now is the time of revolution, yes?
Yes, I believe that it is a combination of several processes. First of all, the accumulation of data enables us to look at more safely at the facts. Before that, when we had less information, we tended to say, well, maybe we did not excavate enough, maybe we don't have enough material. Now, accumulation of information help us to be more confident in our conclusions. In addition, as you mentioned, I believe that also psychologically and socially, the state of Israel, after over more than 50 years of independence, is now more confident in its existence and more mature, and is able to look more critically at some of the aspects of its culture than before that we were more hesitant. So in a way, I believe it's another sign of our progress and ability to look more in more critical way at the ancient past and appreciate its different layers within the culture. As I said, the mythological one and the historical one, without being afraid that it may damage our identity, our national identity, or whatever.
How people receive the article in this country, and also American archaeologists, Jewish archaeologists there?
Well, in this country there were very varied reactions. I would say that many people, as you mentioned, were surprised. They were, but the surprise was not. I mean, they did not have any necessarily negative attitude. They were surprised because this is entirely different from what they learned, from what they were used to hear for so many years. But and they were ready to hear about it. There were many conferences following this paper. Many conferences were arranged in the country, and thousands of people attended in these different conferences discussing the relationship between the Bible and archaeology and the Israeli society. So in this respect, I find the general reaction very positive because it rose interest in the questions and discussion. Obviously, some people were afraid that it may damage our political situation, that our enemies will use it as a weapon against our so-called right for the country and so on. But I think that these were the minority, and these were the majority accepted, and with great interest, with surprise and interest, and are ready to consider the results of scientific work as important contribution to the knowledge of the nation. Now abroad, it's again the same for many archaeologists in the States. These are I was not I did not surprise them because these are known and discussed for many years, these topics. For the general public, it was like for the Israelis a great surprise because again they are educated on these traditions and they believed in the historicity, and some were very unhappy with this. Basically, the Christian tradition. You know that in America there are 50 millions of Americans who do not allow in the schools of their children to teach the evolution in biology because it contradicts the book of Genesis, the creation of the world. So obviously they would not be happy to hear such criticism about later periods. But again, the majority of population are interested, and not only in the States, all over the world. I was approached by television, by reporters, by radio. Will be participating in December in a conference in New York, discussing this matter. So it rose discussion, and this is what's, in my opinion, most important.
I heard that some group of Israel called you and other people as a negation of Bible or something. Negation?
Yes. Well, there are such attempts. I consider them very unfortunate because we look at the evidence. We have no ideology to negate anything, but just to look at the evidence and to present the facts. I also used to say that it means this attitude means that these people cannot argue with me on the facts. They do not have answers. They do not have evidence which will refute my observations. So they have to use such emotional criticism and not logical one. So in this respect, I think it weakens their point.
I forgot to ask about another question because I thought that it was very interesting what you wrote about the creation of Judaism or Jewish religion.
Yes.
God from Yahweh. did, did when I studied Hebrew here,
Yes.
I was it was very strange that why only one God's name is Elohim. It's something relation about plural.
Yes.
And, but anyhow, can you describe about the idea about how Jewish religion was created in this country?
Well, it is a very interesting and important question, because once we do not follow the biblical reconstruction that the Torah was given to the Israelites in Mount Sinai sometimes before they conquered the land, then the whole sequence is apparently different. And archaeology again contributed to this important data by exploring, by exposing sites where there are inscriptions mentioning Yahweh and Asherah and his Asherah. So a couple of deities, and not only a single god. They believed in a couple of gods and not in single one. This adds to many other critics which considered that the idea that monotheism was developed relatively late in the history of Israel, sometimes at the end of the First Temple period, some would say even in the exile in Babylon. So archaeology in this respect tends to support the later I would say crystallization of the idea of monotheism. A later phase when this idea became the normal, the legal, the obliged belief of the whole nation. The idea could have been before, but as a formal religion, it probably was created relatively late during the period of the monarchy.
And why you choose archaeology?
I chose archaeology because I was interested in the history and in the nature of the country, and so this was for me a very attractive field.
At that time, you couldn't imagine that you will reach such a conclusion.
Not at all, not at all. Most of my study and even my earlier research were in the more traditional, what we call the biblical archaeology trend. And in this respect, as I said, there is a kind of revolution, scientific revolution, in which archaeology also, on the one hand, as I said, the accumulation of data. On the other hand, there are trends, new trends in the world archaeology, moving the interest from the objects to the society, looking more at the social aspects of archaeology. And this probably also directed me to look to this more general question, to separate the archaeology from the Bible and to look at it independently. And this separation helped us to look at archaeology and to see archaeology as an independent study, not as just a subsidiary study which serves Bible, but independent study which has its own agenda, its own questions, and this independence helped to look at what we used to do before in more critical way, and to observe the, in a way I would say, a bias which the biblical archaeology paradigm, biblical archaeology approach caused us looking some of the archaeological evidence. We used to try to find the correlations, to solve the discrepancies, and to find excuses why the archaeological evidence is different. Now we look at it independently and we say we have to reconstruct the sequence of events as we do to any other period, earlier period, which has no written records, and reconstruct the historicity from them, and and then see if it correlates or not to the Bible. But in this way we are more independent science, as we should be. So this is very positive development. I feel much released from the burden of the Bible, from the biases, and I see a progress and revolution, scientific revolution in this respect.
We stand here in a very special place in the history of Israel and the Bible. The name of this place is Mount Ebal, and this name is mentioned in the Bible coming from the mouth of Moses. Moses was the greatest leader of Israel. He took them from Egypt to Sinai by Exodus. He brought them to the Jordan River, but God did not let him enter to the promised land because he did not obey the order of God in the wilderness of Sinai. So Moses stood in the Jordan, which is 35 kilometers from here, and gave the instructions to the Israelites what to do when they enter to the Holy Land of Israel. This is written in chapter 27 of the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy is the speech of Moses to all the people. Now in this Bible, that's the holy book of Israel and the Christians, we have a very strict instruction of Moses what to do when they cross the Jordan. He tells them in the book, chapter 27, to enter to the Holy Land. You can see it here. To enter to the Holy Land. To go to this mountain here, Mount Ebal, and to build here an altar for the God of Israel. And then he commanded them to gather all the people, which may have been tens of thousands of people. They gathered, as you can see, in this valley here, this big valley here, so that everyone can see the altar. And then he told them to make a very big ceremony. And in this ceremony, they became a nation to the God. Here in the book it is written, "O Israel, this day in Mount Ebal, you become a nation for your God." So that place is very important. During the time that passed, more than 3,000 years from the time of Moses, this place was completely forgotten. Nobody ever knew where is the place where they became a nation. And after they became a nation, Moses told them to climb to Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim and to speak the blessings and the curses. This is part of the ceremony. So for many generations it was unknown. About 20 years ago, my students and I, we made a survey, which is an exploration on the ground to look for ancient sites. How can you find an ancient site when you see on the ground pieces of pottery? The pottery, as you can see here, make a stop and I will show them piece of pottery. A pottery which you can see here. This is the sign that people lived here. They ate and drank, and their vessels were broken. And then these potsherds tells us what period. This is exactly the period of Moses and Joshua, 3,200 years ago. Now, during the very long period that passed, not only that this place was forgotten, but moreover what happened is that all this story became a mythology, a legend. So one day we came and found this place, but it was not a building like this, it was just a pile of stones that you can see here. This is how the place looked like when we found it. It was all covered with stones. And then we saw that the pottery is from the time of Joshua. And we wanted to find out what is underneath these stones. And then it became clear that this place was buried by stones. People buried it so no unpermitted people will enter. Slowly slowly, we continued to explore the place and expose it. Finally, we found this very big building. But for 3 years, I did not know what it is, because in Israel there are no parallels of these things. Because all the altars in Israel were destroyed. And you know that Jerusalem is, all Israelite altars are buried in the Temple Mount. So then what happened? We made a sketch of this building. We made a sketch of the building. Can you see it, Ryuichi? This is one sketch. You can see here the ramp that goes up, 2 courtyards paved with stones, and here there is the big building of big stones that are up there, and you see the smoke. And here beside it you can see another ramp, which is here, okay, which goes to a veranda which encompasses, surrounds this place. Now, you have here another reconstruction. You can show it as well, okay? You can use one out of them. This is a very accurate reconstruction on what is found here. But still nobody could explain what it is. Why did they do it like that with a ramp going up? Then one day came a Jewish religious man who was with us in the dig, and he showed us this page of the Mishnah. As you can see, the Mishnah is the interpretation of the Bible from the time of Jesus, which is 1,200 years later than here in Ebal. This is from the year 1,200 before Christ. This is from Jerusalem. As you can see, this is the altar in Jerusalem. And you see a ramp which goes up. You see another ramp here, and you see the veranda all around. Okay? So this is a replica of what was originally the altar here. When we saw this in the holy book of the second temple time of Jesus, okay, we could understand that this must be you can see how similar how similar are the two buildings, okay? You have the same components on each of these buildings. The meaning is that here we deal with the earliest Israelite altar, which is on Mount Ebal, the place that Moses told them to build it, and it is built on the same plan as the later one of the Jews, because the Jews kept the religion and the way to build altars, okay, for many, many generations. So from here came the proof that we deal here with an altar. Now, what is written next? Now I make a show for you. The high priest, okay, he was taking the sacrifice in two hands. With this is written in the law, in the holy book. He take, and I will be the high priest now. He was going like this, climbing up with the sacrifice, with the animal, going up like this, on the ramp, and sacrificing on the fire. When the fire is burning, the high priest is going down back. Going back down. Okay? Going to the second ramp, and moving up, standing here, make the prayers. This is the ceremony which is written in the holy book. This is exactly what we found here. In those courtyards, they prepared the animal for sacrifice. So everything here was according to what is written in the holy books. Inside the altar, we found a field of ash. You know ash? Efer. A field of ash with more than 1,000 animal bones. Now all the animal bones were burned because of the fire, which is also a very good evidence for sacrifice. The animals were all kosher animals which is written in the Bible to sacrifice to the God. So what we found here coincides, suited very good with what is written in the holy books. But as you can see, the facts are very clear here. And you cannot explain this place, I think, in another way than our explanation. Therefore, I believe now this is the best evidence for the historicity of the Bible, early Bible.
חופרים. הנה יש שם אנשים חופרים.
אבא, תיקח אותו למודיעין, גם שם יש את זה. פה כבר לעשות עם זה, לך עם הנוות עכשיו. תביא את השיר? פה כבר לעשות עם זה, לך עם הנוות עכשיו.
We have no more empty buckets unless
They talked about...
you know who has them.
But only to the level of our deacons of our floors. That's what I said. Yeah,
Are we just looking at the whole entire area, or the floor that you
I
just
would
did?
suggest you take it deep. 3-4 centimeters, it's like 1 inch or something. Okay, John, I'm here. Sorry.
Yes. We have no more empty buckets unless
They talked about...
you know who has them.
صحيح.
Yesterday I met Adam Zatal. I went to their site, yes. He said that after he found a lot of opposition ideas and a lot of archaeologists denied that this is not real from the time of Joshua and Moses. How do you think about this?
Well, I respect very much the work, the field work that Adam Zatal has been doing in the highlands of northern Samaria in many years. He really contributed in a very meaningful way to our knowledge of the history, historical demography, and settlement history of this country. About the site on Mount Ebal, I don't agree with him for many reasons. First of all, I don't agree on the archaeology, from the archaeological point of view, because I don't see the building which was excavated there in the way that he sees the building. First of all, well, there is a possibility that the building was used for some sort of cultic activity. However, I don't see an altar there. I think there's a big difference between what he found there and the reconstruction that he suggested. From the biblical point of view, I don't think that such a connection is possible. We need to remember that Zertal is excavating there a site from the 12th century BC. And the biblical material describing as if the period of Joshua, in fact, is not from the period of Joshua, of course. The biblical material is much later. There's hardly a doubt that the book of Deuteronomy was written in the 7th century BC. So I don't see, and it also was written in order to serve ideological and theological needs of the period of the writing, not of the period described in the book. So I don't really see how he can make the connection between a building which, you know, is an Iron Age 1, 12th century building, and a story which relates more to the 7th century BC than to the 12th century BC. Now, I don't deny the possibility that in the biblical material, which was put in writing in the 7th century, there may have been introduced early stories, early memories. All this is possible. But even if this was the case, because the writers used the material for their needs, they put such a spin on such possible early material that it's impossible altogether to work with it today. This is my point of view. So I don't accept Zertal's interpretation both on the ground of biblical scholarship and on the ground of archaeological interpretation.
So what is, I want to know what you said, or your idea about the Exodus from Egypt and the story of Yoshua and David and Solomon.
Well, I would say that there is a consensus today among scholars that one cannot read the biblical description of the time of the patriarchs as a straightforward historical source, which means that we have to look at ancient Near Eastern texts, we have to look at archaeological results, and the attempts to place Abraham in antiquity in the 3rd millennium or in the 2nd millennium failed. So the question is what to do with this material, how to proceed with this research. And today we are, in my opinion, we are more aware of the fact that we have to look first to the date of the compilation of the text and to understand the needs and the ideology and the theology of the people who wrote down these texts, even if there were some earlier nuclei in the text, some earlier material that they used in order to put it in writing. Basically, we need first and foremost to look at the date of the writing, and accordingly to try to understand the background, the historical background. So in my opinion, if you take, for instance, patriarchs as an example, when you read the text in Genesis, what you see, the reality behind the text, the stories, the geographical reality, the political reality behind the text is basically that of late monarchic times, of the 8th and 7th centuries BC, mainly the 7th century, and also a bit later. And indeed, I think that there is today some sort of a consensus, or at least most scholars will tell you, that the texts of Genesis were put in writing either in the Iron Age and then later edited and redacted in the Persian period, in exilic and post-exilic times. My opinion is that most of the texts start in late monarchic times. I don't really see writing before that, but that's another story. In any case, when we look at the text, we see that the reality is that of later days. And then when we look at, we take patriarchs as an example, and we look at the stories, we see that the main, if I had to summarize the stories of Genesis in one sentence, I would say that the stories of Abraham, for instance, are centered around one idea, the centrality and the superiority of Judah over its neighbors, over the northern kingdom, over Israel, and so on and so forth. Now the question is whether we can pull back from that point and say whether there is earlier material that was used in late monarchic times in order to put it in writing. Probably the answer is probably yes. I mean, they used stories, tales, myths, legends that were at that time circulating among the people of Israel about the ancient ancestors of the people of Israel. However, if you ask me whether there was, for instance, a historical person named Abraham, my answer would be that this is beyond recovery, which means that I cannot tell, I cannot say. There is not enough material to say. All attempts to place Abraham in earlier times, in the Bronze Age, failed, as I mentioned in the beginning.
So, did you find some, even small things from David and Solomon's kingdom?
Indeed, the main issue, the main debate today is about the United Monarchy. Mm-hmm. And the question is divided into two or three. First of all, we have to acknowledge that there is not what we know about David and Solomon is only from the biblical text. That is to say, unlike later monarchs like Ahab, like Hezekiah, like Jehu, who are mentioned by the Assyrians, for instance, about David and Solomon we had until a few years ago no extra biblical text. So the question was raised whether we are dealing with the United Monarchy again with some sort of a legend or a myth, not really an historical material. A few years ago, an inscription was found in the site of Dan in the north, which mentions the House of David as a title, as a name for the southern kingdom. And the meaning of this is that if there was in the ancient Near East there was a habit to name kingdoms after the founder, to name kingdoms after the capital and the capital after the founder. That is the reason why, for instance, the northern kingdom is mentioned as Beit Omri in Assyrian texts. That is to say that Omri was the founder of Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom. And since in the Dan inscription Judah is named Beit David, the meaning is that the capital was called Beit David apparently by them, and then they knew that there was some sort of a founder, an early king, whose name was David. So this inscription, in a way, makes David historical. However, I don't think that we can read the nature of the United Monarchy as a great empire as we see in the biblical text. Another point, an interesting and important one, that in Jerusalem, there's almost nothing from the 10th and 9th centuries. Jerusalem becomes a big city, a major town, with big population only in the 8th century BC. So that is to say, 2 centuries after David. Here in Tel Aviv, my students accepted that we have to conduct real archaeological research without any bias, free of any modern theological convictions, and see the truth and then decide how to reconstruct the history of Israel. However, there are circles in Israel for whom the revelations, the recent revelations, recent research is in a way problematic, and not only in Orthodox circles, also in secular circles, because the stories, like the story of a great empire of the time of David, are important not only for Orthodox Jews, they were also in a way important for the beginning of Zionism here, the beginning, the establishment, the foundation of the State of Israel, and before. So it will take time until people will feel free to really accept a point of view like this without really arguing that it undermines the basis, of belief in modern Zionism or something like that.
First of all, the entire historical process of the destruction of Canaanite culture was entirely different historically from what the Bible tells. This is one point. And the other point is that if we will examine many places who are mentioned as destroyed by the Israelites, we know that they were not in existence at that time. Jericho was deserted at that time. There was no Jericho, there were no walls of Jericho. Jericho did not exist at that time. Jericho was destroyed in the 14th century, and even at that time there were no walls in Jericho. Ai, the second place which was supposed to be conquered, did not exist in the entire second millennium. So there is a very long story how they destroyed Ai. There was no Ai at the time. It was destroyed. Gibeon, the place in which they fought against the Canaanites, did not exist at that time. Hebron, an important city in the highland, in the Judean hill country, was not in existence at that time. So you see, so from historical point of view and from archaeological point of view, the biblical story does not fit what we know from does not fit what we know from historical and archaeological point of view. So, and therefore we say the conquest, the tradition of the conquest is unreliable from historical point of view and from archaeological point of view. It can't have been that way. There was destruction. The destruction was entirely different from the way that it's described in the Bible. And the gap between what the Bible tells us and what archaeology and history teaches us is such that scholars think today that you can't use the biblical story of the conquest for historical research. It's so unreliable in every place that you can't, if you would like to write the history of the archaeology of the time, you can't use the Bible. Because it was written in a much later period. We'll talk about it later, when it was written and so on. So
It means
you can't rely on the Bible for writing the history of the conquest and the settlement of the 12th century. For many, many years, the United Monarchy was considered as a point of departure for all historical reconstruction. There were scholars who doubted the patriarchal story, the conquest, the settlement, but the United Monarchy for a long time was considered as a good point of departure for all historical reconstruction. And therefore people believed in what we are told about David, about Solomon, about the great kingdom, about the division of the kingdom after that. So, but recently, all this picture has changed. And so, of course, the interesting thing is why scholars change their opinion, what has happened. So first of all, the emergence of the Kingdom of Israel, it's not an isolated phenomenon. We can see the same process all over the ancient Near East. I talked beforehand about the destruction of many, many kingdoms in all the Syro-Palestinian arena. And so we can see that after the destruction, settlement start to emerge, and then people, united themselves and start to build towns, and then small kingdoms, and then unite kingdoms and build centers and so on. And we can see that the same process that happens in Palestine happened in all over the area. But the process is gradual, Slowly and gradually they built places and improved it and built larger palaces and set kings and officials and administrative system and so on. This is a gradual system. Whereas according to the history, to the biblical history of the United Monarchy, the growth of the great kingdom happened at once, in 2 generations. In all other places, it takes place in centuries. And here, according to biblical tradition, it happened in very short time. It started with Saul and then David, who conquered large areas. And then came Solomon, and in his days, Israel reached its height, reached a splendor which never ever in the history of Israel it appeared again. He built an enormous temple. He built a great palace. He fortified Jerusalem. He built administrative centers all over the country. He set officials and administrative apparatus. He started trade with all the neighbors of Israel, with Egypt, with Northern Africa, with Somalia, with Ophir, Somalia, with Anatolia. There was such, the king of Sheba arrived to Israel. So a process which all over the ancient Near East happened through hundreds and hundreds of years. In Israel it happened in 2 generations. So first of all, scholars say this is impossible. Comparison with all other kingdoms indicate that the way that it is described in the Bible is not reliable. And here, of course, archaeological research helps us, because we can see that at that time the situation in Israel was exactly as we see it in all other kingdoms, in all other places in the ancient Near East. As I told you before, there were villages, some towns emerged, but it's all in the time of the United Monarchy. The urban civilization was just beginning to flourish, and it takes 200 years before the real flourishment happened. So archaeology indicates also that the picture of the United Monarchy don't really fit the way that it is described in the Bible. But of course there are some details that are described in reference to Solomon which do not fit archaeological discoveries. And the best evidence is from Jerusalem, because I'm sure that you heard it from Finkelstein. There was hardly anything in Jerusalem at that time. So of course Jerusalem is built on a tell in place with high rock, So every late stratum, every late town removed everything, and built its foundation on the rock. So everything is destroyed of course. And there is not much chance to find many things from older periods. But still, even taking this problem, you expect to find some, if there was such splendor in Jerusalem at the time, you expect to find something in the excavation. There is hardly anything from this period. We know for sure that Jerusalem was not fortified, whereas according to the Bible, Solomon fortified Jerusalem. It was not fortified, it was hardly settled. So where is Jerusalem of David of Solomon? If it was such an important city, why can't we find any indication for that? And of course the same is true about other findings. All the long distance trade that Solomon developed according to biblical history. We don't find indication for that. So again, if we take the picture of the United Monarchy as it is described in the Bible, it does not fit neither what we find from all other places in the area, nor what archaeological excavations indicate in Palestine. And I would not say that there was no United Monarchy. I think that there was a United Monarchy. I think that Saul, David, Solomon are historical figures. But the historian who described their history tried to portray them in a certain way, to magnify their deeds, to make them much more than what they really were. So I think that this is why there is such a gap between the historical Saul, David, Solomon, and the way that they describe the Bible. I think that these kings really were the earliest kings in Israel. They founded the monarchy, but the monarchy in their days, was in its first stages. So David conquered certain area, probably united some tribes in the hill country or even in other areas. I would think that Solomon founded the temple, but the temple that he built was probably much smaller than the temple that is described in the Bible. So I think that this is the solution, These kings were historical figures, but what they did, what they accomplished was much less than the way that they described in the Bible. They just set, they founded the institution of the monarchy. They started building it. And it developed after that, by later kings. After that, probably the monarchy was divided between Israel and Judah. There were two kingdoms and so on. In their time, there was some kind of, of unity among North and South. After that, it split it into two kingdoms. You see, so united monarchy in the way described the Bible is not historical entity, you know. But still, these were kings, and they started. They founded the monarchy. That's my opinion.
So, from which age biblical description and archaeology or history go together? How do you think? From which age?
That's complicated, you know, because the Bible was not written only in order to describe history. You know, first of all, it's a religious book. It was written first and foremost in order to convince people with a certain truth, with Yahweh, the God of Israel, you know. So this is it's not a historical book in the way that we are used to speak on the term, you know, in our term. It's not even historical book in the term of Greek historiography, of inquiring the past, of casting without sources and so on, you know, examining sources, trying to find out what really happened. First of all, it was religious books written in order to convince people, you know, in Yahweh, in his religion, in the way that they should conduct. And of course, the authors of the book exemplified to the readers the way that one should work Yahweh, you know, all the commandments and so on, how they should behave, what is wrong and what is right and so on. So this is the main purpose of the book. History comes second. So with this book in mind, and of course it's very important literary work also. You know, they try to give very nice shape to the stories and so on. So literary quality was very important too. So with these problems in mind, history was important. They tried to describe the history of their people, but with other aims, with other objects as well. So I don't think that there is a certain period in which there is exact the biblical history is exactly as it happened. But of course there are many details which were taken from sources and which are described in the Bible and fit very nicely into what has happened. For example, I'll give you example from the 8th century, the emergence of Assyria as a power in the 8th century, the arrival of Tiglath-Pileser III in 740 to Israel, and the tribute that was paid to him, the rebellion of Israel and Damascus against Assyria, and the destruction of Israel and the annexation of some parts of Israel by the Assyrian kings. All this fits exactly into what is described in Assyrian sources, and how Ahaz, king of Judah, avoided taking part in the rebellion, and therefore Judah was saved at that time, and he only paid tribute, which is again described in Assyrian sources. And later on, the rebellion of Hosea, the last king of Israel, against Shalmaneser V, the Assyrian king, and how Israel was annexed and its people deported to Assyria. It's described in Assyrian sources. How Hezekiah, the king of Judah, rebelled against Assyria, and how Sennacherib made a campaign, and he paid and how he subdued the campaign, and how Hezekiah became Assyrian vassal. You see, so in the 8th century, we can see that there are many details. Okay.
So Bible was written by who and which age? How do you?
Yeah. Well, that's the most difficult question, of course. when what is written. There is a theory in biblical history, theory accepted by most scholars, that the first major historiographic composition that was written was either in the late 7th century in the time of Josiah or immediately after the destruction of the first temple. This is what we call the Deuteronomistic history. History which includes the books of Deuteronomy up to 2nd Kings, namely Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. This was the first major historical composition that was written. And it's called Deuteronomistic history because the book of Deuteronomy was the book of law for this composition. And all the norms were judged by the laws of this book. In this book it was prohibited to work Yahweh in any other place but in Jerusalem. It's only in this book. And the historical composition, in particular the Book of Kings, insists that Yahweh should be venerated only in Jerusalem, in no other place. And that Josiah destroyed all the cult places all over the kingdom of Judah and in Israel, and so he accomplished the commandment of the book of Deuteronomy. And it was written in my opinion, in the late 7th century, in the time of Josiah, namely in the time of still in the time of the first temple. Other scholars think that it was destroyed, it was written after the destruction of the temple and the protection, that it was written in Babylon. These are two opinions. Now, the question, of course, if it was written at that time, what were the sources that they had? If you are trying to describe the history of earlier periods, hundreds of years before your time, you can do it only if you have sources. For example, if somebody in the time of Josiah would like to describe the United Monarchy, it's 400 years. It's the time that we are the same distance as we are from the Renaissance. So try to think that we would like to reconstruct the Renaissance only by verbal knowledge. We'll know nothing, of course. It all depends on documents. But of course, today we can reconstruct the history of the ancient Near East because thousands and thousands of documents have been unearthed and we read them and we understand what is there. We know much more on the history of the ancient world than people at that time knew, because we have all the documents. We assembled them, we deciphered them, we analyzed them. So to come back to the time of Josiah, to the historian who wrote it, the question is, what sources did he have? How many sources? And that actually come to the question you asked me at the very beginning. For the patriarch, he had no sources, of course. You know, this was before writing entered Israel. Do you need, should I to carry it on?
It's okay, yes.
So you see, the closer to the time of the author that we get, the better is the historical information that is included in the Bible. In particular, from the second half of the 8th century onward, and the 7th century, the biblical history helps much to recover the ancient history of Israel. In older period, in the 9th century, it's more problematic, but you still can use it. In the 10th century, not much is relevant. In earlier periods, it's only tradition, you know, and you can do much with it. That's, in a nutshell, you know, the whole picture.
Still in this country, children are taught in school Bible as history, yes?
No. You know, it's long way, you know, before this opinion, you know, this kind of I mean, referring to the Bible as a book written by human beings, you know, that you judge it in the way that you judge all other books. It's long way before it will happen, you know. After all, the religious parties are very strong in the government, very influential, you know. That has to do with even with politics, you know. And the Bible, and even for secular people in Israel, you know. There are many people to whom the Bible is very important because it's part of our nationalism, you know, part of people feel that the roots in the country is dependent on the Bible and so on.
I think this question is most important in this country because the idea of Zionism has the idea of promised land, yes?
Mm-hmm.
And because of, I think many people don't want to touch these questions, I think.
Mm-hmm. About, well,
promised land.
well, though I'm not religious, you know, I'm so secular. Land is part of the Bible, and the Bible is very dear for me, so I read it, I ask myself, why did the people who wrote the Bible describe it as a promised land? You know, what did they achieve by describing it as a promised land? Yes, and of course, that's the way that they legitimize their hold in the country, and in particular in period in which they have been in the diaspora, for example. If you don't live in the country, if you live in the diaspora, and you want to say this is my country, in spite of the fact that at that time other people controlled it, or only part of the people live here, and so on. So, for this purpose, you invent the term of promised land. It's promised. You say by speaking about promised land, you say, in spite of the fact that I don't live here, it's still mine. See? And therefore, and of course, this concept of promised land kept the connection between Jews throughout all the time, you know, and Israel, because in their belief, it was part of their belief. They are Jews, and they have a land that was promised to them, no matter where they live. In later period, whether in Poland or in the USA or in Australia or everywhere, still it was promised to them. And it all started in much earlier period in which part of the people lived out of the country, in Babylonia, in Egypt, and so on. And still, those who lived in this country coined this term of promised land, promised them to their forefather by Yahweh, and therefore it's there no matter what is the political reality. So it has very strong ideological influence. It's religious ideological premise, which is very, very important to Judaism. And it helped to keep contact between people in the diaspora and the land. So this is very important historical factor in the history of Israel. So this is the aspect of the promised land that interests me. How it was crystallized, at which circumstances, what those who invented it got by coining this term. You see, it's very important. So it is ours from the very, very beginning. That's the importance of it. It's very clever, you see, to say that from the very, very beginning, the God himself promised to our patriarchs, to our forefathers. Therefore, it's so important to say we have one forefather to whom the promise was given. And therefore, we are all his sons, and therefore the promise is relevant to us. It was promised to us. It's very, very sophisticated book, the Bible, the way that it was written.
And we have now more than 2,000 cell lines, and we are continuing to collect from different ethnic groups, from families and from individuals.
This is where we separate the blood cells.
Yes,
When
yes.
you get
Uh-huh.
centrifuge,
Yes.
centrifuge, and this is a microscope where you look into the samples and you can see how the bulk of the cells, and here is everything under. Okay. We get blood samples from different people who are collecting for us samples, and we go through the procedures of preparing cell lines. Here it's all very kept under sterility. We infect it with EB virus to increase the number of cells, and it takes about 2 months using the incubator here, first in small bottles and then in larger bottles and even larger bottles, until we get a large quantity of cells that we then store in the liquid nitrogen. It is about minus 200 degrees, and this is being kept here for eternity. אתה רוצה לעזור לי לפתוח את זה רגע? As you see, this is here. כדאי לקחת...
זה מאוד צריך בזהירות.
בזהירות תיקח, כן.
זה בסוף כן בטוח.
כן, לא חשוב. אז תפתח אחד. And in each box, you can see there are 100. No?
Up to 100.
Up to 100 in each little box.
This is only numbers.
Only number individually.
So you don't know if it's Jewish or...
No, it looks the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It depends on number after that.
Number. It can be number in a book and in the computer, and it is booked. In fact, I went to the Department of Anthropology and studied anthropology with major in physical anthropology. This is in the early 60s. And when the time came to choose the subject of a thesis, most of the anthropology students chose studying various American Indian tribes. And I was not very interested in that. I went to Bet Hillel Institute next to university and looked in the library and found a book by the previous president of Israel, Ben Zvi, the Book of Samaritans. I looked in the book and I thought, well, this is a small group, a sect, a Jewish sect, who regard themselves as descendants from the original Hebrews. They have never left Israel, never left Palestine, never went into diaspora. And they were like a biblical family, and I became interested in them, and I did both my master's thesis and my PhD in the States on the Samaritan. Another interesting recent direction of studies are the uniparental genes, like the Y chromosome, which is inherited only from father to son, from son to grandson. This is the Y chromosome goes only in the males. So all the genes or the markers on chromosome Y are not affected by whoever the women are. And a recent large study of 1,200 individuals from several Jewish and non-Jewish populations around the world shows that there is a common probably a common origin for most Jewish populations, including several Middle Eastern populations, like the Palestinians, like the Druze, like the Lebanese. Very different from Europeans, very different from Africans or Asians. And we provided the DNA from for the Jewish population. This is, by the way, the paper that came out a few months ago in the proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences, PNA, and it made a lot of noise. Until now I get letters and requests, and people are very interested in this particular publication. Some think it should affect the present political situation between Palestinians and Israelis. Another uniparental characteristic is DNA, mitochondrial DNA. This is inherited from mothers, only the mothers to her children, both boys and girls. But the boys marry women, so they transfer the mitochondrial DNA of the wives they marry. But the daughter continues to transfer the mitochondrial DNA of their mother. So it's a maternal inheritance, only from mothers to daughters to granddaughters and so forth. And it is interesting that unlike the Y chromosome, there are many more variations, and there is more diversity between mitochondrial DNA in the different Jewish communities and others, which perhaps indicates that there is more marriage with non-Jewish women than with non-Jewish men. The mating patterns among men and among women may differ, and this is all revealed in the genetics of these uniparental genes. But the story is certainly not finished. I mean, still the Genome Project, although a major part of it, or stage of it, has been already completed, there are only several thousand genes known out of the 50 to 100,000 genes, so continuous work is being done on more genes, and we might find more interesting results, whether among Jewish or among non-Jewish population, and the story will hopefully become a much more complete than the present completion of the puzzles here and there. La Bible, you see a whole story of the genetics of the Jews, and also about this article, but in the Israeli paper, Haaretz, ומי הכי דומה גנטית ליהודים? הפלסטינאים. עשו בכוונה איזשהו ככה פרובוקציה בדיוק. שזה לא מה שנאמר במאמר כמובן, יש דמיון. Here there is a group of populations, and one can see, about this particular paper, as I said, this was done on more than 1,371 males from 29 different populations. I said one of the results of the statistical analysis of 19 markers along the Y chromosome, there was a cluster of groups, including Jewish and Middle Eastern, very different in comparison to sub-Saharan Africans, to European, even to North Africans. And this is why we concluded that Jewish and Middle Eastern non-Jewish populations share a common pool of Y chromosome haplotypes. Now, of course, we have to remember that we are only talking about the Y chromosome, not on other. There are many other chromosomes. There are 22 other chromosomes, and there is a X chromosome. To say about the Y chromosome, definitely the results are accurate and interesting, but this is not the whole story. We do find differences between Palestinians and Jews in terms of various diseases, in terms of other genes which are not on chromosome. And again, another example, this deafness gene that we found in Palestinian was only found so far in the Palestinian family, not in any other Israeli family. Well, this paper on the Y chromosome made a lot of noise, I must say, positively. I really do not remember any criticism. In fact, various people from whom I haven't heard for many years, they wrote and congratulated about these findings. And it's also interesting that all over in the States and in France and in various other places, the results of these studies have been published, and people ask me whether it did affect in any way the political status, which I don't think. I did not speak to politicians about it, but I have some Palestinian friends. I have shown them the article. They were very pleased, and obviously everybody saw in it the biblical story of Abraham and his two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. And as you know, Palestinians and Israeli are regarded as cousins. But this is just the literary part of the story. The story of the Y is interesting, and even among North African groups, let's say in North Africa there were four Jewish communities in Morocco, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia. There are quite a few differences between the different North African Jewish communities. Libyan and Moroccan Jews are not similar at all. And so this only again strengthens the idea that they were isolated and did not mix with local, even not Jewish population.
I think many people hope to find the Gene Yehudi, like genes of Abraham, like this.
Yes, well, while I understand this wish, I generally try to be very careful about this determination of Jewish genes. In fact, I keep claiming there is not a thing like a Jewish gene. We are talking about frequencies of certain genes, and certain genes are more common maybe among Jews because they have been living amongst themselves, as are certain genes more common in European populations, in Norway, in Finland, and there are particular diseases there. There are genes which are common in Japan and other places, but there are no Jewish genes. There is nothing like a gene which determines the ethnic group of the person. We can talk about genes which are similar, which are different, and genes are changing all the time, also as a result of mutations. I mean, we are not all, I mean, we are. Mutation rates are very slow, luckily, but throughout the years, genes, even without admixture, are changing within a population. So I'm generally very careful about it, and on the whole we are talking about a similarity between people of 99 and even more so %.
Before you showed some articles from United States here, yes?
Yes, not articles from the newspapers.
From newspaper, yes.
Yeah, well, just how people are looking for good news politically, but it's not science. It's just, I wanted to show you how, yeah, here Jews and Arabs share links. Don't know where this is from, California, and this does not say. This is also South Carolina, and somebody collected for me to show how much influence this particular article on the Y chromosome had on local newspaper, but this is Denver. People are yearning for similarity, closeness, and ability to help, you know, cover your enemies and come towards them and make peace on basis of genetics. But the question is if this is indeed will help or not. I don't know. I have not heard from Arafat. Somebody wrote to me that I have helped to oops, what did he say? To levatel, to cancel a third world war. With this paper, there will be no more war between Israeli and Palestinians.